Aviation fans, welcome back to another episode of Imperial Diecast. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at a 1/500 scale British Airways Concorde in the old Landor livery, made by Herpa. As you can see, this is what the packaging looks like, and we have here a picture of, I believe this is the model. Yep. And let's see, over here we have the Herpa article number 507004. If we take a look at the back of the box, you can see that we have a wingspan of 25.5 meters, a length of 62.1 meters, and a height of 11.3 meters on the real plane. So let's unbox it. I managed to get this plane for €6.50. Absolutely insane price from a store that went out of business, probably due to the low prices. And here it is. The one and only Concorde. Ah yes, the Concorde. The pinnacle of civil aviation engineering, and a plane that should be in every airplane model collector's fleet. Because the 747 is impressive, but it was just a bloated people carrier. The Concorde, on the other hand, wasn't just supersonic, but could even cross Mach 2. Mach 2, as you know, is twice the speed of sound. At ground level, that would be almost 2,500 kph, but at a cruising altitude of 55,000 feet, where the air is colder, you can reach Mach 2 at a slower speed of around 2,200 kph. So we have a civilian airliner several times the length of fighter jets. In fact, almost the length of a Boeing 747 that could not just go supersonic, but also twice the speed of sound, flew almost twice as high as today's civilian airliners do, and on top of all this, could maintain supercruise at Mach 2. Supercruise is the ability to fly at supersonic speeds without the need of constant afterburners. This is an ability that even way smaller modern fighter jets struggle with, due to all the drag from the missiles and stuff that they're carrying, so they usually always use afterburners. The wannabe Concorde, the Tupolev 144, had to use afterburners all the time as well. And so, while the Concorde wasn't the only supersonic civilian airliner ever made, it was the most successful one. And all this could be achieved because the Concorde was a joint Anglo-French project between BAC and Aerospatiale that, among other things, also laid the groundwork for further collabs between European countries, which eventually made Airbus possible. Production of the Concorde began in 1965, but it wasn't a full 10 years until the Concorde was certified for service. Ironically, by that time a lot had changed in the world of aviation, and goals that were popular in the 1960s, like flying being a thing of glamour and luxury, a one-in-a-lifetime experience, and flying faster thought of as the future of aviation, had, in part because of the 1973 oil crisis, changed into goals like better fuel economy, and lowering ticket prices, and transporting more people at a time, and complying with noise regulations. You also have to remember the Concorde is a single-aisle narrow-body, with only 2 seats on each side, not even 3. And that was already considered tight in the 1960s, when you had single-aisle narrow-bodies like the 707 that had 3 seats on each side of the aisle. But by the 1970s, when wide-bodies entered the market, it really pushed Concorde into a niche of travel. So, while they had originally planned to build 350 Concordes, only 20 ended up being built in total, as most carriers had cancelled their order in 1973 when the oil crisis happened. You know, I've heard a lot of people say the DC-10, the death craft, as they call it, was so notorious that it ended not just its own career, but also took the Concordes along with it. And when they don't blame the DC-10, they put the blame on Concorde's Air France Flight 4590 crash in 2000 as to the reason why Concordes aren't flying anymore. But I think it's an excuse. I believe the real reason for the Concorde's demise was a combination of two crucial factors. One was the fact that the planes were aging, because Concorde production had ended all the way back in 1979, and by 2003, all Concordes were at least 24 years old, or even older, which in the aviation industry is already several years past the age when planes tend to be retired from passenger service. The second reason revolves around the main purpose of the Concorde having been rendered obsolete by the 2000s. You see, back when it was conceived in the 1960s and entered service in the mid-70s, its purpose was to transport rich people overseas much faster than regular planes could, so that American businessmen, for example, could attend meetings on the European continent, or vice versa, several hours quicker, and in these circles of society where time is money, also make more money, to the point where paying for an expensive Concorde ticket to arrive hours earlier was worth it for these business magnates. And they'd even get to travel back home on the same day. This concept, however, while it made sense for the super rich in the 60s and 70s, had been rendered pointless by the late 90s as the age of emails, instant messaging, and video calls was taken over the business world. Add to this the September 11th attacks that happened a year after the Concorde crash, and which added a cloud of fear and paranoia over the entire world of aviation that would last for several months, and you can see what I'm getting at. So if that accident involving the DC-10 debris on the runway hadn't happened in 2000, I think the Concordes would have still been retired before the end of the decade. Just not in 2003, but maybe a few years later at best. Not just because they were aging, but also because despite their high ticket price, they weren't moneymakers. British Airways and Air France, both government-owned companies, were operating the Concorde as a source of national pride rather than profit-making, and had in fact been losing money with each flight for years. And part of that problem was the fact that so many restrictions had been placed on where the Concorde was even allowed to fly, mainly because the Concorde was loud, and shortly after it had entered service, many countries, including the US, also with Boeing's lobbying, had banned it from flying over land, cutting it off from many markets, and it also consumed 4 times as much fuel as other airliners did, but transported only a fraction of the passengers other airliners could carry per flight. So what remained were the horrendous ticket prices, and therefore the Concorde would have remained unaffordable to the average person had they kept operating them. And the entire aviation industry for the past 50 years has also been only shifting in one direction, namely from making money off a small group of rich people to making the same amount of money off a much larger group of poor people. I mean, the 2000s being the same decade where the Concorde left and the Airbus A380 entered service proves exactly this point. And with the rise of low-cost carriers, right up until 2020, the world of aviation was increasingly only headed in one direction. Transport as many people as possible, pack them in like sardines into huge wide-body airliners, make all services optional, but keep the fares low so that they keep coming. And now we're entering an age where there is increasing demand for airliners to be as fuel-efficient, eco-friendly, and low-emission as possible. So I hate to break it to you guys, but we will never see engineering marvels like the Concorde in the near future again. the market only caters to demand. And faster air travel isn't one of them.
So let's begin our proper review of Herpa's model by taking a look at the port side of the aircraft at the L1 door. And it doesn't have the porthole, but it's pretty simple looking. We've got the British Airways titles to the bottom right of it, and of course the Speedbird arrow, the red trim. The windows, or the window line here, if I can zoom this properly, doesn't have any silver frames, but it still looks okay. We've got the L2 door here, and then the L3 door at the back. And of course over here we have the
beautiful Landor livery with the House of Windsor's coat of arms.
You can also see some additional detail on the vertical stabilizer here, such as that protrusion,
which is the fly-by-wire PFCU operating the rudder.
And now if we take a look at the wings of the plane,
you can see that the Concorde is a design unlike any other. This is what's called a delta wing. What's unique about the Concorde is that because it's a delta wing, it doesn't have separate flaps and elevators, as would be the case with normal planes, where the flaps and ailerons are on the main wings and the elevators on the horizontal stabilizers. Instead, these are called elevons or tailerons, an amalgam of the words elevator and aileron, or tail and aileron. Underneath the wings, we've got the engines. Now, these engines are the famous Olympus 593s, which were turbojets with afterburners that provided a 20% thrust increase. The Concorde is powered by 4 of them, and each of them weighs 3 tons. It had a cruising altitude of 55,000 feet, at which point you could definitely see the curvature of the Earth, and a range of only around 7,200 kilometers, which was just enough to cross the Atlantic. And taking a look at the front of the plane, you can see that we have this very pointy nose. Now, this is of course the flying position. When the plane would taxi around, it would have the nose in a droop position, where the pilots could see the taxiway better. And here's a look at the starboard side of the plane. And there's actually supposed to be another door back here, right behind the wing, which I actually find surprising that Herpa didn't print it, because even old generation Herpa models never got the number of doors wrong. But it's probably because that door is actually a cargo door, and old gen Herpa models didn't print cargo doors. The plane is also missing the registration, and it's missing the tailstrike protection wheel. But you get the latter two in the new generation Herpa Concorde releases that are, however, priced at around €35, and some are even offered in the nose down position, which looks really cool. But if you decide to go for the more expensive new generation one instead of this old generation one, you gotta decide for the nose variant before buying, because the nose can't be moved. And now taking a look at the bottom of the plane, you can see that it says Herpa right here. We've got the nose gear and the main landing gear, and of course the 2 engines with the back part painted in black. And it also says Concorde on the fuselage. You also got like these little rakes here for the airflow, I think. There's like a little seam here, but otherwise it's pretty much a good single casting. Now for comparison, I have here a 1/500 scale Boeing 747-400, and of course you can immediately tell the difference in the size of the fuselage, because that's a wide body while this is a narrow body. But perhaps the point that I'm trying to make here is that despite its slender size, you can see that the Concorde is indeed almost as long as a Boeing 747-400. And both of these planes came out in the same decade, the 1970s, And you can see that they were two completely different visions of aviation, competing with one another. Of course, we know who won in the end, but yeah, it just shows how much differences and at the same time amazing feats on their own that humans were capable of back in the day.
So I hope you guys liked my 1/500 scale review of the British Airways Concorde in the old Landor livery, which I think looks absolutely amazing, even though this is an OG Herpa model with clunkier landing gears. The front landing gear looks just like the new ones, and while the plane does lack a few extra details that you get with the later releases, like certain no-step markings on the wings and the cargo door, and of course the tailstrike wheel, I'm really happy that I managed to get this for a low price, and if you're interested in more airplane reviews, you can find out some of my other ones here. So take care, have a wonderful day. This is Imperial Diecast, signing out.